was King David's third son. He killed his brother Amnon for what he did to his sister Tamar. 2 years later, he decides, 2 years later after he had raped his sister, I should say his stepsister, he killed his brother Amnon. He flees to Geshur for around 3 years with his grandfather there. And then Joab decides he wants to bring him back. So he brings him back to Jerusalem. When David sees him, he says, you can bring him back on one condition. That is as long as he doesn't have to see, they don't have to see each other. So he's there for about 2 years, and at this point he's sick and tired of everything. So he has a meeting with David. Sort of goes lukewarm, probably there's no reconciliation there in this meeting. And at that point in time, Absalom decides he's going to start acting like a king. And we see Absalom, start doing some things. He's acting like a politician. He's winning the favor of the people. The people are all falling in love with Absalom. And after about 4 years, he decides to go to Hebron, and they lead a coup against King David. And then David, he flees from Jerusalem. Absalom goes to Jerusalem, and in order to become king, he knows he needs to go ahead and defeat David there. David had two advisors Absalom had two advisors. One gave him good advice to go ahead and take out David. The second one gave him, he was one of actually King David's trusted men. He basically gave him some advice which allowed Absalom to be defeated. So then when they go into battle, like we read last week, there's around 20,000 Israelites killed. And Absalom was caught in a tree, and at the very end we saw where Joab killed him and buried him there in the battlefield. And that's where we ended up last week. We're going to pick up there this week about David mourning Absalom's death and the events that happened there. Okay, as far as our sick list, Shannon just told me that Delford he was at the VA. He came back to Scottsville, being where they've taken him to Bowling Green, but yet they can't do surgery, so they're taking him on down to Vanderbilt right now to have surgery done. So he's going to Vanderbilt to have surgery. And I guess Miss Frankie's still in the hospital. She's home now. Miss Frankie's at home. Anyone else we need to mention this morning? Been a busy week. Vacation Bible School is behind us. Church camp is behind us. It's half the year's behind us already. So we're moved into July. It's going to be a beautiful day, it looks like, here today. So if we don't have anything else there, we're going to Trey up here and read, and we'll get to our lesson here in just a minute.
Bow with me, if you will. Our most kind and gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and all your many blessings. We pray that you be with all those who's mentioned this morning as sick, that you'll give them a portion of health if it be your will. Dear Lord, we're thankful for all the visitors this morning. We pray that you be with them during their travels. Go with us throughout this service. Help us to bring glory to your name. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, this morning I'll be reading from 2 Samuel, chapter 18, 19 through 33. Then Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said, "Let me run now and take the news to the king, how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies." And Joab said to him, "You shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to the Cushite, "Go tell the king what you have seen." So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. And Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, "But whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite." So Joab said, "Why will you run, my son, since you have no news ready?" "But whatever happens," he said, "let me run." So he said to him, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up on the roof over the gate to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. Then the watchman cried out and told the king. The king said, "If he is alone, there is news in his mouth." And he came rapidly and drew near. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, "There is another man running alone." And the king said, "He also brings news." So the watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Amahaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." So Amahaz called out and said to the king, "All is well." Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who had raised their hand against my lord the king." The king said, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Amahaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant and me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, and I did not know what it was about." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. Just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day and all those who rose up against you." And the king said to the Cushite, "Is the man Absalom safe?" So the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you to do you harm be like that young man." Then the king was deeply moved, and he went up to his chambers over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. O Absalom, my son, my son."
Okay. Again, that's one of the places in the Bible is pretty tough reading there. Really sad what's happened there. But again, I guess the question is, do you think all that had to happen? How the events played out? Do you think this was all God's plan, or is it just David's life? God's plan, yeah. God's plan, yeah, but you're right, David had done a lot of things to cause this to happen. David wasn't, this could all been prevented, like we talked about a while ago when Absalom came back to Jerusalem there for 2 years. He had 2 years that he was living there. He could have went and talked to each other. They could have actually discussed what was going on. They could have hashed out their differences, whatever you might say. But that was not the case. David, for some reason or another, chose not to reconcile with him. And, during that 2-year period and prior to that, even past that, after he was there probably, there's a lot of animosity built up. It was his son, and we don't know, but you would think, though, if David had taken a different path through all this, even though Nathan had prophesied that there'd be trouble in his house throughout, if David had actually taken the time, spent time with Absalom, tried to reconcile it, if all these events had taken place the way they did, but it didn't happen. So this is what we see here. So if anybody has any comments, feel free to speak up. This is during this time. We're going to start out with the first question here. So what happened to the first son of David and Bathsheba? He died. Yeah. And again, this is where all David's problems start. He took someone else's wife. He had a relationship with her. He slept with her. They had a child that was conceived. He tried to have the husband killed. I tried to get the husband to try to trick him, but ended up having him killed in battle. And it said there too. It said over in I think it was chapter 12. It said God spared David's life, but Nathan told him that the child would die and his house would always be. I think in our reading today, we're not going to read that, but on page 323, it's got the scripture there in chapter 2 Samuel 12, 7 through 11, that deals with the fact that there'd always be strife in the house of David for what the sins that he had done. Question number 2. Who was the army commander who stood by David when his son Absalom rebelled against the king? Joab, yeah. Yeah, Joab's an interesting character, what do we know about, what ought did Joab do? We've talked about Joab the last 2 or 3 weeks, he'd actually be a great person to study, but what all did he do? What was he known for? He was loyal, yeah. He was, when Uriah the Hittite was killed, he actually withdrew in battle from him there. He was one we talked about a while ago. He brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. But what did he end up doing to Absalom? We talked about last week. He put the 3 spears through his heart. I don't want to say he killed him, but he, if it didn't instantly kill him, he would have died, soon after that. But yeah, he was pretty loyal to David. But he was also, pretty ruthless. He's also David's nephew. So again, he's one of those people that, if you were a king, probably somebody you'd want to have on your side, because again, we'll see here too later on. I don't know if we'll get to this or not, but he, a lot of things that David did. He gave David good counsel, and of course, David ends up in the end having not Absalom, but having Joab killed, or not having him killed. But he tells Solomon to have him killed when he takes over the kingship. But again, Joab was pretty loyal to David, and probably got David to where he was at with a lot of things that he had, with a lot of advice and stuff that he gave him at the time. Question number 3, who were the priests who stood by David as he escaped from Jerusalem? Yeah, Zadok and Abiathar. And we didn't really read this. They put this question in here, but they brought the ark. When David left Jerusalem, when he was fleeing the city, they brought the ark to David. And David told them to take the ark back to Jerusalem and to stay in Jerusalem. And so when they went back to Jerusalem, they were sort of his spies, you might say. So they remained there in Jerusalem, these 2 priests did, and they were able to send news to David what was going on there and tell him what was happening. Zadok, interesting, he ends up becoming the high priest under Solomon, and basically his lineage of priests remained all the way up to almost to the time of Christ. Of course, the other one, Abiathar, he didn't turn out so well. He supported David's other son who tried to become king, and he was pretty much banished from the kingdom. But these 2 men remained there in Jerusalem. They were priests, but they were also spies for David. Question number 4. Who was the priest's son who wanted to bring news of David's victory to the king? Yeah. And I don't have to say that. I've heard it a different way. I try to say it all at one time, Ahimaaz. I don't know if that's right, but you'll hear everybody pronounce it totally different. But when he came in, he was alone. What did David think when he saw him alone? Good news, yeah. And why would it be good news? What's that? Yeah, that. And also, too, he's alone. If it had been bad news, you probably had him and the rest of the army coming right behind him there, trying to run. So, he saw him. And also, too, we didn't really talk about, we talked about the fathers, his father being Zadok, being there in Jerusalem. But also, too, this wasn't the first time he had ran and gave news. He was like a messenger from Jerusalem to King David when he left the city. When we talked about last week, when David crossed over the Jordan, the news that he got there, it was from Ahimaaz. He was the one who brought the news to David. He almost got captured during this. But he brought the news to King David to tell David to cross over the Jordan, and which was a good move there. It's funny too. It said that when he saw him running, what did the watchman? What did he think? What did he say about Ahimaaz who's running? He said, it ran like Ahimaaz, So you think of that, and I think you think of almost like Forrest Gump. He's running like this. You got this little specific run, but probably not. It's probably the fact that he brought messages before. So this wasn't his first first time he had ran to bring news to David. But when you first read that, you wonder how he ran. And also, too, Ahimaaz one day would become a priest because he was the son of a priest, so he was in that lineage. Any questions? I mean, any comments so far? Okay. Question number 5. That's a little tricky question here. What message needed to accompany the one which told of David's victory? Absolutely, yeah. You know, how was Absalom? How was a young man? And what would you expect the king that he sent his troops into battle? What would you expect the first answer, the first question to be when they came back? When you had a messenger come back from the battlefield, what would you expect? How'd the battle go? Yeah. There's a lot of questions you would think, but how'd the battle go? How many troops have been killed? How many? What were our losses? What were our casualties? How many survived? Are we safe here? There's a lot of questions that could be asked there at that point in time. But again, that was, it wasn't what David asked. It showed that, really didn't show a lot of concern for his own soldiers. And, you had people out there giving their life on the battlefield to protect him, and he's mostly just worried about the condition of his own son. So you can look at it two different ways there. You can look at it as a father's love for his own son, but we'll discuss that in a few minutes. But again, like I said, he had a lot of chances there before this event happened to show his love before they actually ended up in the battle and innocent lives being lost. Okay. Question number 6. Who used the 3 spears to kill Absalom? Joab, yeah. And we talked about last week, it never said he actually killed him, but when it happened, he had those 10 younger men that came in and then finished the job, you might say. Of course, King David told them to deal with Absalom gently. They didn't do that. And after they killed him, what did they do? Absalom, what did he do with him? Threw him in the pit, yeah. Covered him up with rocks. Just left him out there in the field. And you think about it, I don't know if they ever brought the king back, a dead warrior back, but probably in this situation, it wasn't wise to bring him back because they asked him to deal gently with the young man Absalom, and Absalom put 3 spears into him, and he had 10 other people go at him also. So I don't think he probably was something wasn't something you want to see there. So I would assume David, he'd seen him in that condition, would probably been, and he probably heard about it anyway, because I think when the messenger ran back last week or this week, it said, the king knows. I think it's last week. It said the king knows everything that happens pretty much. So I don't think everyone was silent about what actually happened to him. But that brings up another interesting question. Should Joab obey David in this situation? When he came dealing gently with Absalom. What you think about Joab? What should he have done? Should he take him alive? He saw him hanging in the tree. He could cut him down, took him back, and said, "Here's your son back." Do you think he did right or wrong, or? Huh? Trey too. Yeah, the king. Yeah. To be honest with you, I think what he did was, this may sound bad, was almost the right thing to do, because this wasn't just a kid going out and stealing the car and your dad catch him out running around. They went into battle. It said last week there's 20,000 people dead because of this incident. So it wasn't, this was a civil war also. We think about civil wars in this country, and if we were to have, we always talk about the red states and the blue states, we hear that. But say we had a war here in this country, civil war, people fighting against each other. You got different nationalities, you got different races, you got all kinds of different people fighting against different, for that belief. But over there, most of these individuals were descendants of Jacob. So you had all of Jacob's lineage. So these are actually brothers and family members fighting against other family members. So when we talk about civil war, this was a family war almost. It was not good. So if he brings him back to Jerusalem and said, "Here he is," what's David going to do with him then? Is he going to kill him? Because because he never had punished him before. He couldn't let him go. So, I mean, it would put David in a bad situation. He couldn't just sit there and say, well, here's your son back. And then David's got this dilemma. Okay, we defeated the army here. Now I've got Absalom. What am I going to do with him? So, I mean, when you look at it, I know it sounds bad, but, you know, to me, it's somewhat like Joab. That's why I was saying some of the things Joab did that helped David's kingship. You know, I think this is one of them. You know, by him killing him, you know, it probably prevented a lot of problems later on down the road that could arose from this. But, and also, too, I thought it was interesting, too, you know, it talked about last week Absalom's monument. I read about that. You know, there's still a monument there today. I think it says the Kidron Valley. I just read this. But it's not really Absalom's monument. It's Absalom's monument was been destroyed years ago. But this is what they give it credit to. This was probably built somewhere around before the time of Christ or something. They still call it Absalom's monument. And they say now to this day, when Jews go by, they spit on it. And also parents will take their kids there and teach them. And they tell them the story about Absalom as a lesson. It's almost like a lesson for the kids to. So it's still there in the Kidron Valley, and people actually still visit that site today. But you know, it's become almost a teaching tool for rebellious kids. So I just thought that was fairly interesting. Any comments at this point? Quiet today. Okay, question number 7. What did Ahimaaz answer when the king asked about the well-being of the young man Absalom? They didn't. It's fun, yeah. You go back and read this. I'm going to read from the New Living Translation, NLT, I should say. But some of these translations break it down a little bit easier, or a little bit easier to read. But he said, he asked him, he said, verse 28 says, Ahimaaz cried out to the king, everything is all right. He bowed before the king with his face to the ground and said, praise to the Lord your God, who has handed over the rebels who dared to stand against my lord the king. What about the young man Absalom, the king demanded? Is he all right? Ahimaaz replied, when Joab told me to come, there was a lot of commotion, but I don't know what was happening. So, you know, you can imagine. First of all, we go back to the story. When Ahimaaz wanted to run and tell King David what happened, what did Joab tell him? He told him he couldn't go. He said, you're not going. You know, there's no news to deliver today. The king's son is dead. Then he sent the Cushite there. But then what did Ahimaaz do? Yeah, he got there. He kept asking. He begged. He said, can I go? Can I go? You know, so I think Joab just said, fine, go, run. You know, get out of here. Leave me alone. So he sends him. But, you know, he really wasn't supposed to be taking the message. But he ends up getting there first. And, you know, you think about this. You can imagine him running the whole time. You know, he's probably thinking what he's going to tell the king. He's like, man, I've got, you know, I know I'm not supposed to tell this, but, you've been somewhere before, and you're thinking, you're getting your thoughts before you get there, you know. So he runs. You know, how far it is, I have no idea. But then he gets there, and he tells the king, hey, you're probably out of breath. Hey, we've won the battle. The king looks at him and says, how about Absalom? He's probably at that point thinking, you know, I probably should have been second, you know, or, you know, this is not a good idea. Why should I listen to Joab? He realizes then, his whole message that he was ready to deliver probably went out the back door. He's probably like, I'm not telling him what happened, because what typically happened when you told the king bad news? Yeah, they kill you, yeah. So he probably realized, you know, I think we've all been in that situation. You go to tell somebody something, other than you start to tell them something, you can read them, you're like, I'm going to end this conversation right now. It's not going any further. And I think that's what probably happened. Of course, you know, but yeah, he did not, he didn't tell him what had happened. He just sort of beat around when he got to that point, I think they basically call it gibberish. You know, he just started just mumbling, you know, just trying to answer something or other, but not to tell him exactly what happened, because he knew at that point in time it probably wasn't a good idea to do that. Question number 8. It says, what might have David done to be a better father to Amnon, Absalom, and the other sons? Discipline, yeah. Anything else there? Responsibility? Yeah. If we were to look back on page, the bottom of page 325, it says, his failure with Amnon and Absalom may be seen in the way he handled their request. To Amnon's request, the king called forth no questions. He simply said to his daughter, now go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him. When Absalom later sponsored a festival for the king and his family, he said, please let the king and his servants go with the servants. At first the king said no, but in time he relented and allowed his sons to go. It seems David's sons learned no self-discipline and took no responsibility. I think, and I think the author, he says this and he assumes that, but I don't know if we have a lot of anything to back it up that he didn't get responsibility. I mean, I think he's looking at this maybe, trying to give us a lesson today with our kids. We do need to teach our kids self-discipline. We need to teach our kids responsibility. When I read that question, I thought a lot of David's problems was David himself and the culture they lived in. We look back in chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, his first 6 kids were about 6 different women, and that was the culture there. But you can imagine that, what Absalom's mother's telling him, what Amnon's mother's telling her, they're all telling everybody everything different, We don't know. We said Absalom waited 2 years before he killed Amnon. It may have been the mother might have been sitting there complaining the whole time to him, she's killed your, she's done wrong to your sister. You need to kill him. We don't know what happened there. We also know David, what was his example he gave? Yeah. It's like, if you go out and do something, of course, David, he had slept with Uriah's wife and had him killed. I'm sure everyone knew that, they counted the days back. They figured out the time schedule. It was awful big coincidence that they had a child and this child died, but yet this lady's husband was at war, but she was already married to David. I mean, you can start figuring out the timeline. People probably knew that this was not a secret, that David probably had Uriah killed. And these kids probably knew that too. And it's just like your kids, you tell your kids, well, if you go out and do something wrong, but you come home and tell your kids, your kids see your example too. I think that's part of it here. What David had done, I think played a lot more impact upon his children than what the responsibilities or the things that he taught them, because I don't know how much one-on-one conversation they had with kids back in those days. I mean, I think nowadays we do. I think we're with our children. When you've got one mom, one dad, hopefully that's the way it may not. I'm saying, but if you've got that family structure, you've got 2 people working with that one child, and you can sort of mold them and shape them. But you got mom here, mom there, mom here, brother here, brother here, brother there, and dad's trying to control all these people. It's not an easy situation. So you can see how things sort of got out of control. And but David didn't have exactly right, and he didn't teach his own kids self-discipline, because if he had of, he would have seen Bathsheba and he would have said, that's not something, that's another man's wife, and that other man's wife, that other man is out defending me. He is a soldier in my army, which I should be out leading at this point in time, but I'm not, because I decided to stay in Jerusalem this time. So David, he did not show self-discipline. And I think too, I think a lot of the problems David had with his kids was just the example that he had himself, that he had upon them, the things that he did. Any comments? Go ahead.
He didn't get to build what he wanted to build because of his lack of self-discipline. And you can also go back, and I know it's just a one-time thing, but Moses didn't get to see the promised land and get to go to the promised land because he didn't exercise self-discipline. He smoked the rock instead of speaking to it. I mean, God, holds us accountable to our self-discipline. And it doesn't mean we won't end up in heaven, but it does affect what happens here. We can be what's gonna happen will take place and play out.
Yeah, and again, that's all our kids. Our kids, if our kids came in here and talked and got up here and taught this class, they'd be like, well, my daddy, and that's, they've seen us act, they've seen our bad sides, they've seen all things. But you want to try to be consistent as you can. We all make mistakes. We all have fallen. We all will fall. We will all continue to make mistakes. That's going to happen. But I guess you want to try to avoid the big ones, you might say. Any more comments? Question number 9. What did David do when he learned his son Absalom had died? Yeah. And what did he cry out? My Absalom, yeah. And, I think it's interesting too. He says, oh, my son, verse 33 says, oh, my son Absalom, if I had only died instead of you, oh, my son, my son. You can see his dilemma here. I mean, obviously it's sad, very sad. But again, all this could have been avoided too. He did not, did not have to reach this point. And it may have. I mean, he could have went to Absalom and we don't know, and welcomed him back home and been it may still happen. We don't know. But again, you would think some of his actions led to this. But he says, if I could have died in your stead, I mean, he could have. I mean, that could have been arranged easily. I mean, he could have died and gave him the kingdom. So. But you can see a father's the grief there that he's experiencing there. But and it was and you read about it, it's almost uncontrollable grief, they say. But the interesting part about it is we don't really study this, but but the next chapters, verses 1 through 4, I'm gonna read this real quick. It says, word soon reached Joab that the king was weeping and mourning for Absalom. As all the people heard of the king's deep grief for his son, the joy of that day's victory was turned into deep sadness. They crept back into the town that day as though they were ashamed and had deserted in battle. The king covered his face with his hands and kept on crying, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, my son, my son." So he kept crying, he kept screaming, and you've got these people coming back from the battle. What had they done during that battle? Of course, they'd won the battle, but what else had they done? They had given, yeah.
The rain was bad, or whatever it was, they said they probably ran out of quilts and ran in the valley and hung themselves with trees.
Right. And all they was, anyway, they put the lives on the line.
I know, there's been a lot of bloodshed, a lot of death, other than just one person.
And what do you usually, when you win a game, when you are victorious, what do you do? You celebrate, yeah. And here they come in, and they're all celebrating, and they walk through the gates. And what's David doing? Crying. He's wailing out loud, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son." And what happens, it says their joy turned into, it's almost like I think it said that it was almost like they had been deserted the battlefield. Like they were in the battle, and they had just withdrawn and came back. And that's not what happened. They had won. They'd won a great victory. And here he was, basically, it's almost like going out and win the state tournament in basketball or whatever. You walk in the locker room, the coach in there throwing, kicking over lockers and stuff. Yeah, exactly. Here Absalom, what would Absalom have done to David if he'd seen him? Killed him. He'd probably killed him and said, yeah. He was ready to kill him. And yet here, all these men that went out and put their lives on the line. These family members, you got wives and children there saying they're glad to see their husband coming back, and you've got the king over here screaming, crying about his son. It shows no concern, no contempt for those people. And that's another place too. We're not going to get into this week. That's where Joab comes in and straightens him out. He says, listen, these people went out here and they gave their life on the line for you. And if you don't go out there and act like a king, today your kingdom will be gone from you, because pretty much I think Joab was threatening him, I may turn on you here because, you went too far, and he went too far in this whole situation. And like Joey told me, you've done more damage today than you've done in the whole time without all the events leading up to this part. Mm-hmm.
I mean, were they gonna have their battle, a bunch of people killed, and then the battle was over, and Absalom was just gonna come home, and they're gonna have cake and ice cream, and, you know, love on one another? I mean, what did he expect? I mean, it was either he was gonna die, or Absalom was gonna die, one or the other.
Exactly.
There's only, you know, one of those two situations.
And like we talked about earlier, had he not died, then what would they done? How would they?
I was thinking a lot of times in this situation too, we today in our culture wear a lot of different caps in different situations, and we have to realize the role that we are in whatever condition. I think he was being a father, which is altogether appropriate for him to mourn his child, but he was in the presence and wearing the hat of the king or the crown of the king, and he should have been able to distinguish what behavior for what situation. And that's easy to say, but I think in our own lives, oftentimes we need to understand who we are, where we are, what role we're in, and because, especially as Christians, because people are expecting us to do it right with whatever role we might be in. I think David was just overwhelmed with the emotion and was focused as a father instead of his role as a king.
And emotion, and like I said, emotion was fine, but his point was almost excessive, you know, to the point that. Exactly right.
The role of the king.
He didn't drive it or made some effort to keep that from happening in the first place, you know, but he never did. And but he was, but he didn't. But at that point in time, when he should have been acting like a king, he was too busy acting like a grieving father, which. Again, it's I guess it's easier to say, but again, you had Absalom, but the hatred and stuff that he had for David, is pretty tough.
Kind of went back to his mind about how he could have caused this not to happen, because he could have reconciled with him. He was his son. He could have reconciled and done this in private a long time, or tried to. You know, he caused a lot of this. And I think he's having remorse over it should have been me, because maybe I made the wrong decision, maybe I made the wrong mistakes, whatever, you know, you're just going back through your head kind of as a father. But David caused, or it looks like to me, that he could have changed the course of history if he just gave him a son or done something different. Maybe he did make it all God's plan, I don't mean that, but I mean, your action, reaction kind of thing.
I read an article this week, 27% of family members have become estranged to other people that, you know, and stuff. He was talking about, so this one girl who went to her father's deathbed, and it's too late, you know, that type of thing. People get estranged from parents and stuff, and then it's too late to change. And I think a lot of times too, that may be the reaction he's getting there, because it's like, whoa, I could have, you know, it's too, I can't go back. And also too, someone you read, what was his reaction when the young child died? He got from bathed, because he said, what am I going to do? I'm going to go to what? I'm going to be with him. And I just wonder sometimes too, if in Absalom's case, he realized there may not be another opportunity to be with Absalom. I don't know, but that's a thought there too. Okay. It says, question number 1, why is it important for a parent to give responsibility and discipline to a child? Why is it important to? Yeah. You don't want the world to teach your children. You don't want TikTok to teach your children, you know, because there's a lot of things on there, you know, that, you know, unfortunately that's where we're at in this world. But yeah, you got to have your kids, you know, like I said, you got to practice this like you said earlier, but you've got to, you know, teach that to them. Teach your responsibility. You know, teach them that, you know, that they have responsibilities. You can't be like a helicopter parent, run around and take care of all the problems all the time. But you can sort of sit back in the background and when they mess up, be there for them too. You know, it's sort of a give and take situation. But and I guess the question or two, what evidence is there that David failed in that regard? Yeah. Yeah. I don't think his kids had any respect for him. They, you know, if Amnon had any respect for his dad, he wouldn't have done that to his sister. You know, I just don't think they, you know, they didn't have a lot of respect. They didn't have, and I think that's where they have respect for authority in general. And I know that, you know, David, we talked about before, David, when King David, that's the one thing he did. You know, he had, you know, you see Amnon probably would kill David. He had the opportunity. When we've seen David, well, how did David treat Saul? He showed him respect. Yeah, he had a chance to kill him a couple times. You know, he went in and cut off his cloak. You know, David had opportunities to do things, and that was, you know, David had that respect. But again, his kids did not have that for him at all. And question 2, how did David demonstrate his anxiety as he awaited news concerning the battle between his men and Absalom's men?
News was good or not based on how many runners there were.
Yeah, they said he was in between the two gates. I guess it's a fortified city at the outer gate and the inner gate, and that was a safe place for David to be. So he's out there, you know, instead of being secluded or whatever, you know, he was out there waiting anxiously to find out what his fate was, or what had happened there. And again, you know, you would think that he was worried about the battle, but in the end, it was his son. The last question we went to, it said, why did Ahimaaz reach David with news about Absalom before the Cushite? And why did Joab send the Cushite first? How did he get there quicker? Huh? Yeah. It says he ran by the plane. So again, we don't know if he, you know, in your mind you think he ran past him there, but doesn't necessarily mean that. You know, he might have went this way, he went that way, and both of them would get there. But the thing he said, you know, why did Joab send the Cushite first? Yeah, you know, Ahimaaz was one of his own army people there. The Cushite, he was probably in Ethiopia, so he, you know, David thought he may not go easy on him, but at least he wouldn't. He's gonna kill somebody. He'd rather kill him. He'd rather him not kill a future priest as opposed to killing just someone else there. The bell rung yet, or? Well, we're gonna cut right at. Just because the bell hadn't rung, we only got 13 minutes, so we'll go ahead and stop it there. Thank y'all.